You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're sharing a panel discussion on California high-speed rail. Hosted by Rodger Rudick of Streetsblog San Francisco, Carter Lavin, Eric Eidlin, and Boris Lipkin discuss what it would take to get the project done faster and all the potential benefits. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com.
You have successfully arrived at our conversation. This is about getting high-speed rail in California finished in 5 years. Now, that may sound a little crazy. Can we really do it in 5 years? But let's just go over a little history here. So in 1962, President Kennedy said, we will go to the moon before the decade is out. 6 years later, humans traveled to the moon, and a year after that, they walked on the moon. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in 6 years, and they started construction during the Civil War. I would say that's a pretty big socioeconomic challenge for starting a big project. And then in our lifetimes, in just the last 15 years, China has built, and I still look at this number and I'm like, how is this even possible? 25,000 miles of high-speed rail. So when we talk about what's possible, what's impossible, clearly we could finish California's high-speed rail system in 5 years. It can be done. It's within the realm of physical possibilities. The United States could pull this off. We've pulled off greater challenges than this. So let's start this conversation with Boris Lipkin, who basically is in charge of construction for Northern California with the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Boris, if I wrote you a check for, and I think the estimate is something like $100 billion right now, I'm gonna get my checkbook out, start writing. How long would it take? What are the challenges? How are we gonna get this project done faster? And I guess you can start out by saying, where are we right now for people who need to know that?
Thanks, Roger. I'm happy to jump in and help sort of maybe set the stage a little bit for this conversation. So as you mentioned, my role is the Northern California Regional Director for the High-Speed Rail Authority, as I oversee the project from basically San Francisco out to Merced County. And just to give a sense of where things stand today, right now the authority has 119 miles under construction in Central Valley. So you can see the bridge behind me. That's one of the structures, and that one's actually completed at this point. And we anticipate the first construction package out of that 119 miles to actually finish in the coming weeks. Contributors towards the electrification of the Caltrain corridor, and that 50 miles is well on its way. It will be largely ready for high-speed rail by next year. At the same time, between San Francisco and Los Angeles, so the rest of the system, as we go out from the valley into the Bay Area and down to the Los Angeles Basin, we have over 400 miles of that environmentally cleared at this point. We have one section left between Palmdale and Burbank, and we anticipate finishing that environmental clearance by the end of this year, basically. So how we're doing this is, and with the support of the current administration, we're advancing the program in building blocks with the available funds that we have right now. The focus is on getting trains running in the Central Valley as soon as we can, where the construction is ongoing, and then continue to advance the work to expand out and be ready for the funding that we might need. And to your question about the big check, certainly funding is needed to get out of the valley and to the Bay Area and to Southern California. So that's sort of where we're at. That's what's on our plate. The way we're doing this is in building blocks, as I mentioned. But I guess maybe to kick off a little bit of the conversation around some of the hurdles, if you will, and I can start there and we can talk about some of them in more detail. Some of the big things, of course, is funding is the first one, because if you don't have full funding, not only can you just simply not do the work, but you also end up dealing with a lot of complexity around prioritizing work. So what should we do now? What should we do next? And those are discussions that can take a long time and obviously involve more than just us as the authority. It involves a broader constituency that has views on those kinds of prioritization and setting of those priorities. Other challenges, are when we build even the portions that are already in construction, when we are dealing with hundreds and sometimes thousands of different veto points, essentially, or at least hurdles from third parties, requirements and things that create either blackout windows in construction because an irrigation district might be needing to use their facility that we intersect in some way in a very specific timing tied to the growing season, for example, or BNSF might have a moratorium on the last couple months of the year because that's when all the holiday shopping and shipping happens. There's permitting and other things that all kind of add up to the narrowing of construction windows of when you can actually do work. And now all of those are based on important values that we have, prior rights, endangered species and other things. But those are all the things that are the push and pull on how quickly you can do something. And then the last kind of couple of things I'll mention, of course, is, just the construction industry scale. If you talk about $100 billion over 5 years, that's roughly $20 billion a year. That's not insignificant to the scale of California's construction industry, which is about $900 billion a year or so in terms of its total. So we're talking about some pretty big numbers. It's a question of, can that level of construction happen in that kind of time frame?
So even if we had the money, we wouldn't necessarily have the labor force to do it.
Well, I'm going to hop in on this side, Carter Lavin. I'm a transportation advocate. I've fought statewide efforts across California on a lot of fronts. Most recently was heavily involved with the effort to save kind of traditional or regional transit, BART, community, things like that. Labor shortages are a very common thing that happen across the board in every sector. And when we talk about like the money thing or things like that, like there are people in other parts of the United States who would absolutely love to come to California and do the work. When we talk about the Transcontinental Railroad coming out, there was a labor shortage in Promontory Point, Utah. People move with this. And I think it's important when we're talking about the context within California of, $20 billion a year, that's the highway budget. California on a regular basis, without blinking an eye, spends $20 billion on that. And, yes, there are things, but this is one of those parts, as Boris is saying, when we prioritize it more, it can happen a lot faster. Because we say, okay, well, now we have some people who maybe were working on, they were pouring concrete on construction highway projects, and now they're doing it on the high-speed rail. Maybe there were people who were finishing up in Florida on Brightline, and now they're coming out to California. Like, there's plenty of people out there.
Or even internationally. I mean, the Transcontinental Railroad obviously was constructed by laborers who came from overseas. Obviously not always treated very well, but it was done. And they didn't have the benefit of any machinery that we have today. Eric Eidlin actually is a instructor at San Jose State University at the Mineta Transportation Institute. He also does station planning for the city of San Jose. Eric, what do they do differently? I know you have a lot of experience with high-speed rail in Europe, that they manage to get these projects done, I think, a lot quicker than we do. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for the intro. And I'll mention my class is actually happening right now, and they've joined us. So thanks to all of them. So a couple of things. So these places worldwide with high-speed rail, generally, not in every case, but in many cases, in Europe certainly, there is a deep tradition of passenger rail ridership. I mean, I guess you could say going back, we used to have that, but there wasn't quite the break, in places like Germany, Switzerland, France, from that we saw in the US, where, certainly in those places in Europe, auto ownership is pretty widespread, has been, since the 70s at least. But there was always this sense that riding the train is a really important way to connect places and to get around. So maybe more political support. And also related to that, there's always been a need for station design, making sure that the systems that support a station, whether it's the local transit that feeds into it, that all works well. It's not some theoretical thing that in the future, maybe this would be great to have a rail system that I can depend on to get from Budapest to Vienna or whatever. But it's actually something that people in their daily lives, they have used, and so they see the urgency, and there's, perhaps more political support, which then feeds into, real work. And then there's real work. So there are real people trained and experienced in doing these projects.
Yeah. Well, and I think to that point, just to hop in, and this is why I think the Central Valley segment is such a crucial part. And it's so great that it's happening because, you travel on 99 now, pretty crowded. A lot of people are going to be riding on that. And as Boris, you're saying, okay, we have, electrifying Caltrain, which high-speed rail is paying for a large part of. Now all of a sudden we have a lot of people on that. And now that goes out to San Jose, like that becomes kind of glaringly obvious. It becomes a very easy thing for a an assembly member of San Jose and, an Ash Cholera of someone like this to say, okay, let's like connect these 2 points. And I think you're right about this political will issue of saying, to the BNSF, okay, great, the holidays are important. We still get another week to do construction work or what have you. Or, okay, well, we'll double down on some mountainside drilling. But yeah, like it's kind of building that political support, I think, is a great question.
Is that the key? I mean, I feel like most Californians at this point, at some point in their lives, have gotten a chance to travel at least to the East Coast of the United States and taken some decent, at least semi-high-speed rail services. If not, they've gone to China or Japan or Europe. But is that the biggest challenge here, that we just got to get people into the right mindset, that they say, hey, we spend $20 billion a year in California on highways. Maybe we can spend half of that on rebuilding our rail system.
I think most Californians can barely afford rent. I think most Californians are worried about putting food on the table. Most Californians are struggling. And I think important part is and the high-speed rail is going to help them. When we talk about job access, when you say, okay, you're having a hard time affording rent, frankly speaking, the high-speed rail project is, in a sense, one of California's biggest bit of affordable housing infrastructure is going on. Personally, as an activist who lives in Oakland, I think we should have a lot more people living in Oakland as well. But the high-speed rail is a housing tool. It's a jobs tool. It's a thing like that. And, I think there needs to be stronger voices helping people kind of put 2 and 2 together that way, because, folks are busy. So you got to talk to them and, talk to them and say, okay, this is important. And isn't this ridiculous that they have to stop constructing at this hour, at this time of year because of this thing? Can we tell your county supervisor to pass an exemption or something like that?
Yeah, actually, when we talked before we actually did the session, Carter, you brought up the idea of working in 24-hour shifts and having multiple shifts rather than working overnight. I mean, Boris, is that something we could do? I mean, look, if this were an existential threat, if it were World War II or something, people just built stuff as fast as they could and all the stops were taken out. What would you say are sort of the first stops that we, as political activists, should be looking at taking out so this can get built faster?
I guess to your question about, are we doing nighttime construction, for example? The basic answer is most construction happens from basically 1 hour after sunrise and then until 1 hour before sunset. That's the typical window. There's often restrictions on nighttime construction based on habitat and other things that might be around or the context within which you're building, whether you're in a community or other folks you might disturb with light or noise during the nighttime. Of course, there's some things like you might be drilling a pot that will take 36 hours and there's nothing you could do. You're going to work through the night on those kinds of things. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the number one thing is, and it seems like the basic answer, but having certainty of funding lets you set up a schedule that you can then work to deliver. And that's by far the hardest thing on this project is this project has never been fully funded. So when the voters approved it in 2008, they gave us basically 1/5 of the money and said, hey, we want this high-speed rail system, but go find matching funds somewhere else. Now, we've been very fortunate, that in the intervening years, we have been able to meet the matching requirements out of that original bond and advance the program, with strong support throughout the years. But the question of, well, how much do we do now and how much should we advance each piece really gets to the schedule, right? Yeah. It gets to how soon can we see trains? How soon can we extend to the Bay Area or to Los Angeles out of the Valley? And so those are the kind of practical realities. Of course, there's lots of things about how do we design tunnels? We have several long tunnels that we need to build. Those are some of the long lead time items. Do we have multiple entrance points where tunnel boring machines basically, tunnel towards each other? That's kind of a common technique that gets used on longer tunnel construction. But there's kinds of new things also would need to bring to the construction industry. There's no rail tunnel in the US that's over 10 miles. And so talking about some of the longest rail tunnels in North America that would be part of the system. And so we need the innovation that exists elsewhere to be able to be applied here. And, we're certainly very cognizant of that and working to bring that over.
I know tunnels are a big part of it. Eric, do you want to comment on some of the tunnels in Europe? I know there's the Goddard-based tunnel, the English Channel tunnel. The Japanese have massive train tunnels as well. I mean, it seems to me this is not really an unknown. We just have to figure out, who does it best. Who would you say does it best in Europe and why?
Well, certainly the Swiss and the Austrians have a bit of an advantage there. I was in Europe last month and traveled through the Simplon tunnel, which was the longest for most of last century. That one's 12, but so it was completed around 1900. So yeah, the expertise does exist globally. And I think that's stuff that we can learn from fairly easily. There are, of course, as Boris will appreciate very well, these rules about hiring, American workers, American content, and those are all well-intentioned, but we obviously should try to find the best balance. But to go back to your earlier point, Rodger, I mean, you brought up the sense of urgency, like if this were the Second World War. Well, I think a lot of people would say, this last month, July, was the warmest on record, right? Mm-hmm. And, we heard about temperatures off the coast of Florida above 100 Fahrenheit, temperatures in the Mediterranean Sea, 5 degrees Celsius above normal. So some people would say, there is a climate apocalypse in Europe. Many people are, and you might have read about this, are refusing to fly because of the climate implications. They are, traveling by train. So obviously this project will take a long time to build. So the payoff will be in the long term. But I do think we do need to be thinking on that time horizon. It's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions in 5-10 years, but in 30 years. And, how are we setting ourselves up for the future long term?
Along those lines, California's high-speed rail project should be, in my view, seen as sort of a first step. I mean, we're going to build a world-class 220 mile per hour rail line between state's two biggest cities and its most populous cities in the Central Valley. I wonder, though, if maybe the approach isn't, at least from a political perspective, and Carter, this is something you can touch on, I think, isn't a little misguided because we've allowed the reporting, and maybe this is my fault too, to focus a little too much on this one line. I mean, it should be viewed as just the beginning, and eventually there'd be a lot of connections built into it. Brightline West to Las Vegas comes to mind, which would eventually join the high-speed rail project. But I wonder, with the growing climate emergency, should we be maybe selling this to the public as, a real sea change and how we get around?
Yeah, I think so. To be clear, the number one source of carbon emissions in California is cars.
Yeah.
People driving their cars. And so when we're connecting tens of millions of people with high-speed rail, when we're connecting the 6.5 million people who live in the Central Valley with a high-speed rail, this will offset so much. This will get so many cars off the road, which is, hey, for the truckers of the world, great boon to them. But this is one of the biggest shifts in carbon emissions. This is a massive, it's not the equivalent of planting a rainforest, but this is planting a huge flipping forest equivalent of carbon emission this. And also, fun fact that a lot of people don't know, the High-Speed Rail Authority has been doing a lot of mitigation for their construction work. There's a lot of, this is a giant tiptoeing very, very gently through communities and all this stuff. It's just wonderful. But, I think, we're at a point where people are protesting autonomous vehicles that are driving in San Francisco because it's more cars on the road. We have people protesting in Oakland yesterday. Oakland is about to unleash a new carbon bomb by expanding the Oakland airport drastically for a ton more flights. And as Eric's saying, flying is cooking the planet. And there's so many flights from the Bay Area to LA or Bay Area to Southern California. There's gobs of them. And just displacing those flights with rail is going to be one of the massive things. But when we as rail advocates, when we as justice advocates, when we as climate advocates are talking about this and talking with our friends in other parts of the environmental movement, I think people have lost the plot about kind of what the rail is and why it's done. And so now that we have a clean energy goal in California and made a ton of progress on clean energy, and we keep needing to do that, but we haven't moved the needle at all on transportation.
Well, I wonder, do people in general realize that a high-speed train doesn't actually have a tailpipe? I wonder, does the average person understand that? When we say it's zero emissions, it really is zero emissions, and it really is potential. We already have the technology. The Europeans are doing this. The French high-speed rail system, I don't want to get into nuclear power, but it's essentially run on nukes. No CO2 coming out of it at all. So most people are moving around France without generating greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, maybe Eric or Boris could address that a little bit. Is that something we just have to get across to people in the United States and in California?
I think that this project, and both kind of what it is and how we're doing it, has sort of been at least part of California's ambition towards and leadership in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We made the commitment in 2008 that we would run the system on renewable energy. At that time, that was sort of this, lofty goal. Not a ton had been sort of studied about what's feasible in that regard. I think BART is on their way to running on 100% renewable energy by 2025. So, what was a lofty goal at one point is now sort of, it's not mundane yet, but it's certainly within reach. And so, I think that California has always positioned itself as a leader on these issues and continues to take that role. So I think that's still very much part of the bones of, what we're doing and how it fits into the overall big picture of what we're trying to do in terms of, as I think Carter was trying to explain, taking cars off the road, taking planes, the air industry is much decarbonized even than cars are. And so this is sort of part of meeting our greenhouse gas goals is certainly one of the things that we're trying to achieve, along with all the connectivity, economic benefits that a system like this offers. Maybe one thing to go back to an earlier question that you're talking about, some of the differences between us and Europe. And the thing that comes to mind for me, or Asia in this regard at least, is that in many ways, high-speed rail projects are sort of the largest projects that governments usually undertake in terms of transportation, certainly. In other parts of the world, that becomes sort of these national priorities in a way that I don't think we've penetrated yet. Now, I think we're certainly the largest rail construction project anywhere in the country. I can tell you that right now, and probably one of the largest, transportation projects total. But that hasn't, at least to this point, fully reflected sort of the national prioritization of these things. What I think about is sort of in the, if you go back 50 or 100 years, we've invested, trillions into cars. We've invested hundreds of billions into airports. We've invested probably tens of billions into rail. And so what we have in our project is that the state so far has been about 85% of the funding that the project has received has been state funds, with only about 15% from the federal government. When we did the highway system, that was basically the reverse. There was 80 to 90% federal funding for the highway projects.
And I want to step in on this, particularly about the federal question, because one thing that's been frustrating for me as a person who's traveled throughout California a lot and loves California deeply is, frankly, there's a lot of people who just throw way too much shade on the Central Valley. The Central Valley is larger than 32 other states. Like, the Central Valley alone, what's happening at 6.5 million, check population thing, like that alone is a massive, gigantic project, and alone is great. We obviously want to do the whole thing. Obviously we will, and we can do it in 5 years. But when people talk about federal funding, just because California isn't balkanized like, all these East Coast states where it's I've gone on runs in the East Coast where you like cross state boundaries. It's hard to do that in California. We are still paying the federal government. California has given the federal government billions of dollars in the time period of this project. And so this should be a federal priority. And I think one thing in terms of advocating for that money, of saying, hey, Senator Padilla, hey, we have a Senate race going on right now. Barbara Lee, Katie Porter, and Adam Schiff are going across this country, across the state, trying to tell everyone, vote for me. And a big part is we say, okay, what are you going to do to get the high-speed rail done faster? Because this is a national priority. And they might say, well, it's like, okay, well, this is one of the biggest things, it was just the 1 year anniversary of the IRA, the big federal funding. And it's like, this is a cleaner investment. This is going to do more to lower emissions than a lot of other projects. And it can be done in 5 years. And I think a big part that people don't understand is people think that, from just my conversations and seeing the comments on the post when I announced this part, people think construction's happening 24/7. Like, people think, the high-speed rail has all the money and it's just getting frittered away. And they don't realize that, like, you have to sprint to a construction site, do a bunch of things, and then get out of there for BNSF to do whatever they're going to do. Or that, like, various people are able to say, oh, no, you can't do this construction work now, and you have to do it elsewhere. Like, they don't realize that 20% of the work has just been fighting to do the work. And that is a huge delay.
Yeah, I think they also don't realize that the federal government has, sort of given billions in matching funds and then cut it off and then tried to claw it back depending on the change in administration. And I wonder, Eric, we've got high-speed rail in all these other countries with different political systems. China's political system is pretty different from France's, is maybe not as different from Spain's, between France and Spain. But how come all these other countries can figure out how to get behind what is to them a basic transportation system, and their federal government will continue to support it? And ours, it's become this highly politicized left versus right battle. Like, that's something I sincerely have never understood. Do you have any sense of it?
Yeah, well, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying. I mean, you mentioned a range of countries. So yeah, China, obviously, very strong central government. In Europe, it would be, France also has a very strong central government. For them, high-speed rail was a bit of a space race. It was an issue of national pride being the first in Europe. Certainly, it isn't that for us. And then these federal countries like Switzerland or Germany, typically, they're governed by, more coalitions, but generally, whether it's right or left, there is a sense that passenger rail is a real necessity. So maybe that goes back to your earlier question about you said you speculate most people have ridden passenger rail, been to the Northeast or something. So there's the climate crisis, perhaps that's more a priority for some people than others. Another big focus of this project is building communities around the stations. So there's been a lot of work in Fresno, and we can't underscore enough the importance of doing that correctly and making sure those areas right around the stations, they are not just these vast park and ride lots. We're really making the most of them in terms of economic development. We're making these walkable places, certainly in San Jose, that's what we're trying to do. And, really making for seamless connections by sustainable modes, transit, walk, bike, emerging modes as well. That's really a priority. So, I mean, I don't know how many people have really, if you've been to Europe, and maybe if you're there on a work trip, you really understand, wow, how much I can get done when I'm traveling from Paris to Marseille on the train. Going straight from Gare de Lyon in the center of Paris to Gare Saint-Charles in the center of Marseille, and how much time you save by not having to go to this airport that's way out, in the boonies. I think those things and that experience is maybe a little bit harder to convey, but I think the more we can do that, maybe, the more political support we will get. And then all of this, the implementation of the project, I think, gets easier with more public and political support.
To that point, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind when we talk about California and building things, the California housing crisis is deeply connected to our ability or inability to allow things to be built. And when we talk about what's going to happen in Fresno and the hundreds of thousands of people who live there, that's a huge draw. That's a huge thing to build around. It's a huge cluster. What they've done in the Bay Area in San Francisco, that's a great station. All the buses, the bus goes near my house across the Bay Bridge, right in there, and then you take an elevator down or staircase and head off to LA, head off to Fresno. And I think a big thing that is important is it's not about Gare de Lyon or all these places. It's saying, hey, you're in Fresno, people in Merced, you go to Merced. That's not the edge of the world. You'll just take the train. The train's just going to be the easiest thing because you're going to look at traffic and you're like, oh, 99, gross. I'll just go to Merced. Helping people understand that. And I think one thing that's been really interesting is seeing how the high-speed rail kind of tells its story. I think there's a lot of other folks who need to be telling this story as well, of helping people imagine, yeah, you're going to be on the train and you might not go from SF to LA, but there's a lot of people who go from SF to San Jose and a lot of people go from Gilroy, and that's big, that's a story, and helping people understand that this isn't for their children, this is for them. And this is, people have 5-year plans as individuals, and this is part of it.
Yeah, and if I could just piggyback on that quickly. So I think that's one other dimension of high-speed rail and rail generally that is commonly understood, I think, in other places, but not here, is that, it's something that really allows you to tie together multiple cities, and often, not necessarily the very largest cities. If you're taking a plane, obviously you're taking off in one city and you're landing in another. You don't have the opportunity to connect all those cities you're flying over. In a train, a high-speed train, you can do it with relatively little travel time penalty. So, Fresno, Bakersfield, that's a real advantage.
I think this might be back to Carter a little bit, but how do we sell people in the state, let's say in coastal California, who are not going to have access to a high-speed train unless they really go out of their way, even after the initial segments are built?
Sorry, Rodger, I just wanted to jump in on this because I think I just want to give a little bit of perspective on where the state is broadly on the project, because I do think it's helpful for table setting and answering the question that you just asked. A couple different data points just for folks to be aware of. When the project was first approved by the voters, it got 53% of the vote. So 47% of people voted against it. In the most recent polling done by UC Berkeley, the support had risen by a few points. The total support was about 20 points net positive. So support was in the 50s, opposition was in the 30s at this point. But the other thing that's sort of a useful data point for this question is, again, it comes back a little bit to the federal funding, but in the bipartisan infrastructure law, it actually did create a new pot of intercity rail funds for the first time since the Recovery Act in 2009 at the federal level. And so we currently have a pretty large $3 billion application into that funding program, and we've had tremendous support with it. So we've had, obviously support from this administration, but also the previous two governors, Democrat and a Republican. We've had support from 36 members of Congress, both senators. And so to say that there isn't a push behind this from California, we see it every day. There's still always going to be more to do, but I think California is pretty united in wanting to see this project happen. There's all the questions of, how much can we do, how fast? And I'm glad we're having this conversation about that topic, but I do want to, make sure that we, at least at the table of the support is there. And we're very lucky to have that because there's no way to move something like this forward without very, very strong support. And we've certainly had that across the board.
And that's, I think, such a key part. Like there is support there and it's about mobilizing it. So for the folks listening in, when was the last time you called the governor and said, hey, I want the high-speed rail done in 5 years? Like you can Google Gavin Newsom's phone number, you get his office number, you call him and do that. Like that's what it looks like. There is currently, and I've checked around, like there isn't a petition right now where people could say, hey, I want the high-speed rail done now. Like there's a petition to get a crosswalk on the street near my house. And there is not a petition in support of one of the largest pieces of infrastructure going on in America and definitely the one in California. Like there is a grassroots mobilization, which does make it easier for folks to say, like, as you're saying, like, Monterey County, like all these places, helping out. There's this great effort in Santa Cruz to get a rail line there. And because, going over 17 to San Jose is really hard and they're going to link up to Gilroy. And guess what? When you link up to Gilroy, Gilroy is a gateway to the world for a lot of these folks. And it's going to be. And I think when you talk about mobilizing this, whether it's from a climate perspective, which is, hey, you would like emissions to go down. This is the largest single thing that California could do to lower emissions in a pretty massive way and move the needle. If it's from just a pure physics perspective, like we're not going to double the width of 101. It's just not happening. That is a lot. That when you talk about hundreds of billions of dollars, that's hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think helping people recognize that when this happens is a key part, because as Boris is saying, like, this isn't a technical issue. Like, yes, there are mountains, they need hills drilling. As Eric's saying, there are boring machines. And as Boris is saying, it's like, okay, should we do a double side bore like they did in the channel, like a tunnel, in Sierra Nevada, like you can walk into the old rail tunnel there where they did a 4-side. They did 2, and then they dropped a shaft and did it this way. That's probably outdated and fancy machinery wouldn't allow that. But like, we have technical things to do this, and we are a lot closer to being meaningfully done than I think people think about. And so I think the part it's important to know is that, like, if the folks who are listening in want this, like, we got to fight for it.
Yeah, feeding into what we were just talking about, what can average people do to get the feds to sort of get on track with this? I mean, I remember in 2008, there was a grassroots push. People were out gathering signatures to get the high-speed rail project started. Now, what do we do, especially when it comes to the federal government, to get it built faster, get it finished, and carry on from there?
So for the next couple of months, and I'll take this as just Carter Lavin, transportation activist. So I don't work for the high-speed rail. I don't work for the city of San Jose. I could say all sorts of things. Right now, California has a unique situation politically going on in which we have 3 people who are in Congress who are running for Senate, and they are all saying, hey, vote for me. If you are a person who is a registered voter in California and registered to vote, and if you're registered as a Democrat, you have probably gotten a text from Katie Porter's campaign, from Adam Schiff, from Barbara Lee. You're probably going to get calls soon. You'll be getting mailers. You'll be getting everything. And if you want the high-speed rail, saying to them, what are you going to do to get the high-speed rail done sooner? What have you done to support this project? And it's great that they've signed on to letters, and, Barbara Lee's people have done a lot of stuff, and they'll probably say, oh, Congresswoman Lee has done X, Y, and Z. And you say, great, I'd like to hear more of this. And injecting this into that election is such a huge way to say, okay, when we go for this vote, there's all these horse tradings that go on in DC. There's all this stuff going on. Maybe it gets tacked onto a Ukrainian aid package, which, by the way, the federal government came up with $80 billion for Ukraine aid, which is great, and we should. And helping reduce oil consumption in California is a good way of helping hit Putin where it hurts. But we need to ask a lot louder for this stuff. And that's a great wedge point just in the next couple of months.
Or just put rail transportation on the same financial footing as highways and airports.
Yeah.
That would be enough that we could,
Yeah. I'm looking at Boris's background, which, when people are listening to the podcast, maybe they don't see it. But this is a beautiful structure of the high-speed rail going over the freeway. And the question is, is that a piece of high-speed rail infrastructure or is that a piece of freeway infrastructure? And it's like, well, who paid for it? The highway authority could have paid for it. I don't know if they chipped in, but you made their lives a lot better. Boris is shaking his head for those of you who are just on audio. And one thing that I've learned in just prepping for this that's been shocking is the amount of money the high-speed rail folks have had to pay PG&E because they're having PG&E move wires that PG&E was going to probably do anyway. And just saying, hey, PG&E, no, split that cost, go 50-50, whatever, 70-30, cuts tens of billions, tons of this off of it.
So I wanted to get some of the audience questions in here. I think this is a Boris question, but since Carter talked about PG&E, how much of the electrical infrastructure is going to be controlled and operated by the High-Speed Rail Authority, and how much of it is outsourced?
Well, looking to have our facilities, for example, our stations be net zero energy. So basically that they can generate the energy on site for their use.
Oh.
We also have a pretty extensive plan for solar and battery use for the actual train itself. And then this is sort of our work with how we tie into the rest of the grid and everything else is that combination of having renewable energy from the grid, as well as what we actually can generate ourselves and store ourselves so that, as we've all kind of experienced the last few years, and that's reality for parts of the year. And so we want to make sure that our system is resilient to those kinds of disruptions. And so that's where battery storage and other things come in, ensuring that reliability, even when something might be going wrong.
I want to be clear, you're talking about battery banks on land, not on the train.
Yes, not on the trains. The trains will be powered by overhead system, but the power for that overhead catenary system has to be brought from somewhere. And at times it might need to be stored somewhere for a period of time before used, basically. And so that's where that interconnectivity to the grid comes in. That's where those battery storage facilities come in.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, this project is also a major, massive transmission line that's being built throughout California. Not just the high-speed rail, it is the longest tunnels in North America for trains. And it's also this gigantic power line. And I think there's all sorts of other benefits to that.
Boris, a positive side effect of the project is it's making a stronger electrical grid for the state of California. Isn't that right? I mean, the overhead wires are part of the grid.
Yeah, I think the bottom line of having a long linear core has various potential uses and benefits, electrical or fiber or other things. And this is the first new major right-of-way created in the state, probably since the aqueducts and the highway system were built. Those are the last couple that I can think of. And so every time you do one of these, you have opportunities to leverage that investment that's being made. But that's, part of what's new and different here is just the scale of creating a new guideway, creating a new right-of-way is massive. And that's, I think, what sometimes gets lost. 119 miles. The last time we did 119 miles of a new rail line, the Ford Model T was the number one selling car. These are not things that we do every day.
I have an audience question that fits right into that. But Boris, I know the answer to this, but the audience would certainly like to know. Is there someplace they can go and see a drone flyover of the right-of-way that you've built thus far? And I know the answer is yes, but do you have that information? We can put it in.
Yeah, the simple answer is there's a website, buildhsr.com. And it has, I don't know how many hours of drone video and how many thousands of photos at this point of all the various construction. We have lots of information there. We also have lots of videos on our YouTube channel. So if you search California High-Speed Rail Authority on YouTube, you'll find, again, hundreds of construction videos and other information about the project.
Yeah. I also going to put a plug for the Instagram account. I've started following the Instagram account because it's like the drone footage, but they have lo-fi beats. So, for your Zoomers and your lo-fi beat videos, it's kind of nice.
Yeah, and I think this is Boris and Eric, but it's my understanding, and you really see this from the drone footage, when you've got those 100 miles of repaired right-of-way and most of the bridges and flyovers finished, the actual laying of the track doesn't take that long. It's mostly automated. And I've seen films of these machines at work in Europe and in Asia, and they basically, it's itself a long train that basically just kind of hurls the next layer of tracks and rails in front of it. And you just sort of feed raw materials into one end and you get tracks coming out the other. Is that, am I oversimplifying a bit?
You're not it's a little bit simplified because there's other things that go with it. But the basic point, and again, I think we've done a lot of reforms about how we stage our delivery and how we actually manage the project. And that's been kind of one of the key things over the years, and certainly under this administration, that we've been implementing. But once you're essentially out of the ground, so once you've built the civil works, the structures, the guideway itself, you have much more control of your own destiny. So when I talked about in the beginning, those veto points and all the prior rights issues and all those interactions with the kind of external world that might stop you from doing things, you might still have requirements. You might still have no nighttime work in sensitive habitat or community areas or something like that. But you have much more of that universal access of doing the work when you need it and being able to go sequentially down the line. We're going to lay track at however many hundreds of feet per day. And we're just going to keep doing that until we get to the end. And so it's a much more straightforward construction work that needs to happen.
To the point about the kind of original prompt and question of 5 years, could this happen? And I think a big part's look, there's 3-ish complicated tunnels to be done, which can all be done at the same time. That would be a big thing. But the high-speed rail has done the vast majority of the hard work of lining up the shot. This is a little bit of to make a cake from scratch. First, you have to create the universe. There wasn't a train there that we just had to upgrade, except for in the case of, San Francisco down at San Jose and then to Gilroy, in which, that is an easy, I'm not doing the work, but that's easy work because it's an existing track. It's an existing thing. Let's do that. One of the things I'm very impressed by is the Los Angeles Union Station. LA is getting a new station, and Eric could talk about this a lot, but LA is getting a new station basically entirely because of this project. And I used to live in downtown San Jose. What you're doing over there, Eric, is pretty massive.
Well, San Francisco got a new station too. It's just not connected, but
connected with a bunch of bus lines. It's great.
We're working on it. It's moving forward.
I think this is Boris and Eric. We've seen kind of a new model of higher speed trains and potentially a high speed train with Brightline West between Vegas and the Los Angeles area. Rancho Cucamonga, I think, is where it's going to go to. But is this kind of new model of privatization with passenger rail, does it have the potential to change how the California project gets done or to speed it up or to give it any advantages?
I think it's an interesting question. For high speed rail projects, and this is what we've seen internationally, is that the major barrier to a private entity developing these things is the upfront capital cost. The costs are just very big. And so while lots of systems operate on a commercial basis, so basically they can pay for their own operations, they can even generate, revenue and profit out of the fare box, the upfront investment almost always has to come from the public sector. And so how much is Brightline still talking about a fully private project in Southern California? They've applied for the same federal funding that we've applied for. So they're looking for about, $3.75 billion out of that program. The right of way for them has been through an agreement with the state of California to use the median of I-15. Could you have any better luck than that in terms of right of way acquisition and needs? So I guess the bottom line is, if Brightline West is to happen, it sounds like even they've kind of come around to the view that it might be led by a private entity, but will have to have substantial necessity of dependence on the public sector. And from our vantage point, we think that the public sector has to play a lead role on these things. It's just too big of a piece of public infrastructure to happen without the public sector. It doesn't mean that we, don't want to tap into private innovation. For example, for us, we've, had Deutsche Bahn, which is the German rail operator, as a potential early operator for our system. And so we certainly see the operations side, lots of roles for the private sector in some of that. So I think it's finding the right balance in the right areas where the public sector can do something better, that we should do it on the public side, and where the private sector might have some advantages, we should find ways to leverage that.
Eric, did you have anything to add to that?
I pretty much agree with what Boris said. I will say, though, it is encouraging that there is an entity like Brightline proposing on these projects like LA to Las Vegas, which is, by common wisdom, that is a good high-speed rail corridor, the distances. And, they obviously pulled off this project in Florida. It's got some challenges with grade crossings and so on, but they're a real credible private sector entity. So we'll see.
Well, and to that point, I'll say, fundamentally, it's good that Brightline's stepping in and doing one of the easiest projects that could be an easy higher speed rail project in a place that's connecting two cities along an existing right of way. And that's great. And the federal government should give the California high-speed rail and also Brightline some money, because guess what? An aircraft carrier is $14 billion. Like, the idea of scarcity around funding is a total myth. Total myth. The United States is the richest country in the world. We have more than enough money to say, hey, Brightline, hey, California high-speed rail, let's do it. I think for some people who, are watching the projects and they maybe get confused about what's going on, the California high-speed rail is doing, they're not demolishing Fresno to build the rail line, which in the 50s is what happened. Like, I live in Oakland. My city is a city scarred by freeway construction, but the city just can't, like, when the federal government and state entities said, yeah, let's just demolish this, thousands and thousands of people were displaced. That's not happening here. And I think that's really important for that to be acknowledged. And so I think in terms of federal funding, the answer is yeah. And it's saying to Barbara Lee and Katie Porter and Adam Schiff, like, yeah, this should not be the high-speed rail and Brightline competing for this. It should be the government should be able to say, yeah.
Yeah, and to Boris's bigger point about, the important public sector role. So one thing that is worrisome about this Brightline proposal, right, is their terminus in Rancho Cucamonga, which, by what it seems like is going to be this huge park and ride lot. And it's very expensive to extend it deeper into LA, but ultimately to deliver the benefits of high-speed rail, like I talked about that trip earlier from Paris to Marseille, you're not going to get that with the station in Rancho Cucamonga. It's just too far east for most people in the LA basin. So yeah, it's not enough.
Just so listeners understand, California high-speed rail, Amtrak, the commuter rail in Los Angeles and San Francisco, they are on the same gauge of track. So there are opportunities either for people to transfer between different systems or for the trains themselves to continue on each other's trackage. So as systems are built out, there's going to be more flexibility, but there aren't, basically barrier
gauge wars.
Yeah, there aren't gauge wars. It's not like BART where you can't run an Amtrak on BART's tracks and vice versa. It actually is. Fortunately, all these systems are being built in a standard way.
And I'm glad you bring up BART because, one of the things that keeps coming up is this concept of like stable funding. And, BART and other just basic existing transit systems across California were under threat this summer. Gavin Newsom proposed a $4 billion cut to transit funding. And, there's a huge statewide effort to push back. Some of you may have seen the protests around this, but we generated 10,000 calls and letters into Sacramento, into the Capitol, to demand that and reverse those cuts. And we
need to do that with high-speed rail and keep it up.
Yeah, it was 10,000 calls and letters, and that got $1 billion. And it's like, so when we talk about how much money, like how many calls and letters do we need to do to get more than $1 billion, it's more calls and letters. And I think one of the things, though, like BART to the ridership and park and ride, like BART is in the process of converting all these parking lots into housing developments and solve this crisis. And they are making money off of that. That is helping them fiscally do that. Frankly, I don't know if the high-speed rail authority has that legal authority to do that soon, but like giving you all the ability to do that would be a huge boon economically.
Yeah, and I mean, famously, the high-speed rail systems in Japan are actually supported by the real estate. They're basically real estate enterprises, and it sounds like Brightline in Florida, actually, that's their model as well, is they've built a lot of real estate in Miami and other cities that'll, really support the whole system. So any last thoughts from Eric, Boris, and Carter?
Well, I'll just quickly echo, we need a greater sense of urgency and public and political purpose around this project. And I do think we do need more money also in what we used to call the bookends. So, this perception that all the money is going to the Central Valley, given how long it's going to take to build out the system, I think the other parts of the state are going to need to feel the benefits. And yeah, we need to get better at how we're delivering this. So, and I'll just give a shout out to the Oxford scholar, Ben Fluvier, who has been in the media a lot recently, but he has a recipe for how we could do better and is getting attention. He was just in a webinar with the Secretary of USDOT. So some of his ideas are getting some traction, and I think, some of them would apply to this project.
And I would just say that, I know that there's this sort of Christmas morning view of the project sometimes of, I voted for this thing in 2008. Why isn't it here already? And I think this, I'm glad we're having this conversation about being able to lift the veil a little bit on sort of why is it so hard to do these big things? And, what are the trade-offs and values that we have? But I think it's always useful to look at, that lots has been done. And from my perspective, given how much has already been built, The main question at this point is, how much of a high-speed rail system we can have, but it's no longer the question of, are we going to have a high-speed rail system in California? And maybe that's not as satisfactory to others as it is to me, but sort of crossing the viability threshold in this particular context, I think is a huge thing. And so we can still debate, what should we do next and how fast should we do it and all those things. But being past the point where you can just say, we're not going to do this anymore, I think is a huge game changer. And I want to keep that perspective out for folks of just where the program is at this point is sort of past the point of no return.
Yeah, we're well beyond that now.
Yeah.
And Carter, what's the political takeaway here?
I think if you're listening to this and you're a California high-speed rail hater, hopefully this opened your eyes. Hopefully you have a little bit of faith. And, honestly, for the person listening in who might not like the project or has hard feelings, I think the question to ask yourself is, do you want the project done now or do you want it done later? And if you say, look, I just want it done, great. Make the call Governor Newsom. It's a 916 number. You can Google it and you get it. And say, I just want the flipping thing done. And you can do that. And if you're someone who says, okay, no, I like the project and I want it done sooner, it's like, great. You can also call the governor. You can also call your assembly member and your state senator and your county supervisor. And you're going to start getting a lot more contact from all these people running for Senate for your vote. Tell them, say, I want this and I want this now. I don't want this in 20 years. I don't want this in 30. Stop telling me my kids and my kids' kids. I want this now. Because the project is at this point where we can make the federal government and the state government can step in and buy the boring machines, step in and do a lot of this stuff and get it done quickly. And it's something that it's on us as the people who want it to write the petition, make the petition, fill it out, make the call, do that stuff, talk to a friend about it. Because I think as like Boris and Rodger and Eric and, people who've been tracking the project really closely for a long time. Like one thing I want to flag, since 2008, there's a lot of new Californians. A lot of people are alive today who weren't alive during that vote. A lot of people have migrated to California. And a lot of people have left California. The project and we all as people who care about this have to continuously reintroduce people to it and explain that this is the largest piece of climate progress that California is working on right now. That it is ready to go and can be done a lot faster if it was given more permission and money to do so. And that us as individuals or people in your church groups or business groups or what have you can tell elected officials, hey, we need this thing ASAP. And that's what it takes. And we can do that.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And we'll be having many more meetings like this over the next 5 years, 6 years, maybe more.
There we go. Thank you, everyone, so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast. And you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.